to moderate the panel, Contagion and Gender Identities.
Thank you, Lakshmi. I'll come up with my comments later, and I now request all the paper presenters, you've got only 15 minutes, I guess, make your presentation, and I hope today evening you have Ashwini Deshpande talking about giving you the keynote speech. Probably she will talk about, she's been writing extensively about the gender impact of pandemic. So I will come up with my set of comments and observations at the end. I request Anuza Subramaniam to make her presentation now.
Good morning, everyone. I have a presentation, and will I be able to share it now? Am I audible?
Yes, you have been given the presenter rights.
Okay. Is my keynote presentation visible right now? So I think I'm right at the end.
Yes.
Just a second. Let me. Yes. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm presenting a section from my research, which is on gender and social relations in the Indian IT sector, which is a globalized workplace, the changes in work due to the implementation of work from home during the pandemic, and the expected post-pandemic changes in the IT world of work. Now, the reason to focus on the Indian IT sector is that it is a major player in the global digital economy and as an employer in the formal or organized sector of the Indian labor market. India has been exporting software services and products since the 1980s, mainly to clients in advanced economies, especially the USA, contributing to its position as the developing world software leader. This position has solidified during the pandemic due to the urgent need to digitally transform businesses worldwide and is reflected in the exponential increase in the hiring of graduates for IT jobs. The impact of the pandemic on general employment varies from economic crises in two key aspects. The implementation of work from home for many white-collar employees and the total restriction of movement out of the home, especially the indefinite and sudden closure of schools and childcare, which has increased the quantum of household and care work. How does this affect employees in the Indian IT sector, where the work culture, even prior to the pandemic, was already characterized by demands related to flexibility in working hours, working with clients globally in different time zones, and the need for constant personal re-education and absence of formal work rules, and individualized employee performance appraisals in spite of teamwork on projects. In this presentation, I'll discuss the gendered implications of work from home during the pandemic, focusing in particular on the aspects of productivity and surveillance. The second section of my presentation will focus on the earlier representation of the IT sector as an equal opportunity provider and the effects of the pandemic on the same. Companies worldwide adapted to the pandemic by rapidly shifting to work from home wherever possible and have dealt with this transition with varying emphasis on productivity, employee well-being, and creating new work cultures. Indian IT companies were some of the fastest responders in shifting work practices with the onset of the pandemic. The majority of Indian IT companies achieved more than 80% transition to work from home within a month of the national lockdown. Most companies have provided equipment and stipends to ease the transition from the office to the work from home setup. Now, in a sector that already emphasizes on hyperproductivity and flexibility, it is essential to understand the gendered implications of work from home in terms of performance, supervision, and how employees experience this new work regime in varied ways depending on their social locations. In the early months of the pandemic, it was easy to see the benefits of work from home. Employees felt that they were saving time and money due to the lack of commute to offices. They were spending more time with family. And most importantly, they faced reduced risk for contagion. Organizations also had benefits. Work from home boosted productivity and cost savings through reductions in travel costs, real estate management, and so on. On the other hand, the sudden implementation of work from home during the pandemic is an intrusion into the home, especially during a time when the entire family is forced to remain indoors. A disproportionate amount of household and care work carried out by women globally has increased due to this. In addition to this, the mental load of managing household and care work and ever-present work demands, on top of the anxiety of a pandemic, is likely to have a cascading effect on employees' physical and mental well-being and their work performance. Also, working at home with limited physical infrastructure, such as lack of private workspaces, internet connectivity issues, increases time spent on work, which has had differential effects on employees' health and their productivity. Being confined inside the house can also increase feelings of isolation and being trapped. Especially for women, when work is valued as a way to escape the space and norms of home, the pandemic and new norm of work from home has renewed the limits on their mobility and space. The coexistence of paid and unpaid work in the same physical location and temporality has gendered implications. An analysis of the quality of time at work using data from 2 parent households in England by Andrew et al. Found that women were likely to spend less time in work if employed, more time on childcare and housework, and time spent on paid work is interrupted much more often than for men. Interestingly, they found that mothers and fathers doing paid work used to be interrupted at similar rates prior to the pandemic. In contrast, mothers are interrupted over 50% more often now. Surveys have also found that most employees, both men and women, are distracted during work and that they deal with a lot of work-related stressors in work from home. This has had an effect on their productivity. In addition to this, one of the stress-reducing strategies that more women than men were considering is turning down extra responsibilities at work, which could affect their performance appraisal and thus career progression. Work from home as a work model can create new opportunities while simultaneously reinforcing existing power relations of gender, class, and other social axes of differentiation. Indian job sites reported an increase in women job seekers for work from home jobs a year apart, both in April 2020 and April 2021. However, other studies indicate that many find it difficult to remain in the workforce because of the increased workload during the pandemic. Puri et al. Found that 1 in 3 mothers have considered leaving the workforce or stepping down their careers because of the pandemic. Most of these women cite childcare responsibilities as the primary reason. Other factors include lack of flexibility at work, the perceived need to be available 24/7 for work, worry of being negatively evaluated due to caregiving responsibilities, and the increase in housework and caregiving work due to the pandemic. As early as April 2020, a mere month into the lockdown in India, many women IT employees had started thinking of resigning, and few had already done so. In this scenario, it is important to understand how women IT employees have handled the work transitions during the pandemic. The primary concern during the pandemic has been with maintaining the productivity of employees, and several surveys provide evidence of the same. In May 2020, 85% of workers in the American software industry claimed that they could work effectively from home, both as an individual and at an industry level. Some surveys have found that the productivity, both of individuals and teams, as well as employee engagement, remained the same or even improved after shifting to work from home. However, this is not a universal finding. Other studies have found that productivity has reduced, hasn't changed, and if it has increased, it is at a human cost. The reasons stated for decline in productivity include isolation, distractions at home, and constraints in collaborating effectively with colleagues. There is rising disengagement, attrition, and fatigue with the continuation of work from home for 2 years. The effects on and perceptions of productivity of employees are gendered. The performance of women employees, especially mothers, is likely to be judged more harshly since the lack of real-time interaction now can increase the possibilities of biases creeping in regarding their potential or commitment to work. This bias is strengthened when women take advantage of flexible work options, even if their productivity is on par with their peers. Therefore, they are more likely to worry that their performance would be evaluated negatively and withhold sharing work-life challenges with colleagues. Those who are in managerial positions have additional tasks due to work from home in the pandemic. In general, women managers are held to higher performance standards than men, and in crisis situations are likely to face more scrutiny. Khoury et al. Found that women in senior level positions were significantly more likely to feel burnt out compared to men in similar positions, and are 1.5 times more likely to consider leaving work or downshifting their careers. The authors also found that most companies had instructed managers to check in with employees about their workload and well-being during the pandemic. And about a third of the companies had asked managers to take steps to ensure that work-life balance needs of parents are being met. However, only 8% of companies have asked managers to reduce the scope of work of the entire team. If the scope of work isn't reduced, the work is shifted around to other employees who are either unmarried or without children. While this may reduce the workload for a specific employee who is a parent, it will increase the workload for other team members as well as for the manager. Despite the visible emphasis by many companies on the provision of support for employees, they were less likely to address the underlying causes of stress and burnout of the employees who were working from home. They found that only less than a third of the surveyed American companies had adjusted the performance review criteria, considering the challenges brought on by the pandemic, and only about half have communicated with their employees on their productivity expectations during COVID-19. This is likely to cause burnout and stress for employees who face the difficult choice between being available 24/7 for work or falling short of pre-pandemic performance expectations. A common refrain throughout the pandemic was that the productivity of IT employees was maintained or improved, and business projects were delivered on time. How many Indian IT companies have taken into consideration the strain that work from home can produce and adjusted workloads accordingly? In order to measure and maintain productivity of employees, companies have implemented the use of productivity trackers, the sales of which boomed during the pandemic due to the implementation of work from home. Tracking includes monitoring via web camera, keyboard strokes, browser usage, and the measurement of real-time activity on the computer, often without the employee knowing. In the Indian IT sector, where productivity was already monitored and regulated at the workplace as hours logged in at their computers, it is expected that the monitoring systems would transfer to work from home as well. Boyer warns that with the withdrawal of spaces of information processing farther from public view, more rigorous forms of discipline, surveillance, and spatial restraint designed to improve worker efficiency will flourish. This seems to be the case in work from home during the pandemic. The effects of these monitoring measures on employees' productivity and well-being need to be understood. There's some evidence that there is a drain on employee morale and productivity, and yet companies are interested in it as a means of control over the employees. It can also result in intensification of work. On the other hand, employees deal with this micro-surveillance using various subversion strategies. Surveillance has generally been studied in the context of public spaces, and the relationship between gender and surveillance is complicated. While women may feel safer with surveillance in public spaces, since it may reduce incidences of harassment, the entry into homes is less favorable since it extends the reach of the male gaze and contributes to the masculinization of private space. Video surveillance at work is the case, where the presence of an overseer, visible or not, increases their feelings of being under control. It is important to understand surveillance measures used by companies and employees' views regarding the same, considering this. The pandemic has changed the nature of work by accelerating the adoption of digital technology by at least a decade and catalyzing new hybrid work models beyond offices. The way forward seems to be on offering flexible hybrid work models, which include the choice to work both remotely and in office, in combinations that are satisfactory for both employees and companies. New work arrangements that emerged during the pandemic come with a new set of risks, including overhead costs, longer working days, occupational health and safety hazards such as injuries from poor economic conditions and social isolation. Employees' rights to decent work, freedom of association, and collective bargaining have to be re-established to ensure that the new work from home model does not turn into a means for further repression of labor, such as the decision by 7 Indian states to suspend nearly all labor laws during the pandemic. In the Indian IT sector, a field where work was flexible and employees spent long and unpredictable hours when in their workspace, the pandemic has made the home a similar workspace. For work from home to become a sustainable and genuinely flexible model, new work cultures maintaining boundaries between work and home are essential. How far this has been done and how employees feel about their company's handling of work during the pandemic needs to be explored to gain a better understanding of the current Indian IT work culture. In this section, I focus on the representation and reality of the Indian IT sector as an equal opportunity provider before the pandemic and the challenges during the pandemic that may affect this. The Indian IT sector has been portrayed as an equal opportunity provider for young graduates in India. It offers tremendous scope for economic growth and where the success of the IT professional is dependent on the individualistic traits of intelligence, hard work, and skills. However, an individual's position in the global digital economy, as in traditional economies, depends on the access to resources and privileges afforded by class and other social axes of differentiation, such as caste, gender, and geographical region. In its homogeneity, the IT workforce in India highlights the historical privileges of certain social groups. It is dominated by engineering graduates from certain specializations who are fluent in English, who hail from high caste, Hindu, urban and semi-urban, middle-class families, with many of their fathers also being graduates. The valorization of individual characteristics and competencies post-liberalization overlooks the structural inequalities posed by various social axes of differentiation. It therefore warrants that researchers attend to how these intersecting social relations are shaping the IT workplace in myriad ways, especially in the pandemic. The representation of women in the IT industry, an indicator of its apparent gender equality, has been increasing from an estimated 20% in 2002 to 35% in March 2020. The majority of women in the Indian IT sector were under 30, single, and most held a degree in engineering. Informal estimates by Indian IT companies show that the typical length of women's careers is about 5 years. Therefore, it is crucial to look at longevity of women's careers and the type of work they are engaged in within the industry, alongside a cross-sectional view of the total number of the women in the industry, especially in the context of the increased paid and unpaid work during the pandemic. The challenges during the pandemic affect the entry and performance of employees of varying social locations differentially. In work from home, several operational risks and costs are transferred from companies to employees, such as uninterrupted internet connections, electricity supplies, which can affect net income and time spent working. Not all companies provide accommodations to offset this, and performance targets were generally not adjusted to account for operational disruptions. When working from the office, employees had similar access to technology infrastructure and space. Work from home has changed that. Employees may need to make additional investments to maintain their productivity at home. And for IT employees who are from less privileged backgrounds, the disparities in their socioeconomic classes may become apparent in this new work model. It can also set back their careers if they don't have access to the necessary tech infrastructure. Another challenge is the loss of informal interactions with colleagues from varying backgrounds, which could affect intangible long-term gains in soft skills, fluency, socialization, etc. Especially for those from disadvantaged backgrounds, for example, first-generation graduates from rural backgrounds.
Anuza, time is up.
I'm just concluding, Dr. Binitha. It's done on the last slide. In this presentation, I have focused on key aspects of the new normal in working for IT employees, productivity surveillance, and the gendered implications of work from home in the pandemic. It is essential to consider the multiple social axes that IT employees occupy and how it intersects to form their specific opportunities and constraints, and to understand how the pandemic provided them with agentic opportunities or created further vulnerabilities. There are two opposing views on gender and crisis, where one looks at crisis as opportunities to challenge existing norms, and the other argues that crisis reinforce patriarchy by reverting to traditional gender roles and associated increase in familial duties and caregiving. The new work from home model does not necessarily create a gender equal future of work. The evidence so far from studies done during the pandemic makes apparent the compulsion to return to gender normativity within the home that women challenged earlier through their employment. Therefore, it is necessary to understand how women and men resist, negotiate, and redefine existing gender roles and practices. Thank you.
Lakshmi, all the comments together at the end, right? Lakshmi,
You
here?
can navigate as per.
Yes, ma'am. All the comments together at the end.
Okay. I now request Parvathy Das to make the presentation.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, ma'am. Good morning, all. My paper is titled Curing the Pandemic Affected Spaces, Aravani at Project's Response to the Pandemic. So, in my paper, I will be looking at how this particular collective called Aravani Art Project were able to come up with a different kind of embodiment, different kind of collectivity, and different kind of agency for the transgender community through their art, and how through their art they were able to queer the mainstream space. As for the structure of my paper, the first part will be a brief introduction, and the second part will be about the idea of queer space and queering spaces. And then the third part will be about Sara Ahmed's idea of queer phenomenology. And the fourth part is the analysis session of my paper. And in that session, I will be looking at some of the projects by Aravani Art Project and also the existing literature on transgender community during the pandemic. That is the basic structure of my paper. So without further ado, I will start reading from my paper. Since the beginning of the lockdown in India on 24th March 2020, people have resorted to various forms of art to battle with the resultant social isolation. It showed how different states of society were differently affected by the pandemic and the lockdown. While a section of society could enjoy the perks of social media and self-cooked meals in the confines of their home, another section was battling for survival in the wake of joblessness and crowded spaces. Among the latter, the LGBT community was hugely affected as they could not find enough resources in the quote-unquote new normal in an already transphobic and queerphobic space. For them, art was not just a leisure activity and medium for self-expression, but also a means for survival. The present paper critically analyzes the contributions of Aravani Art Project, a transgender, trans woman and cis woman led collective based in Bangalore in battling the pandemic and queering the public spaces that were hitherto considered inaccessible for those outside the dominant heteronormative ideas of self and gender. The purpose of art for the members were twofold. This is the major argument in my paper. Firstly, it enabled them to find new ways to generate income in the pandemic affected environment, which contradicted the general notion of the state as the only source of welfare for the community. Secondly, the idea of curing mainstream spaces through their art. For the primary materials for my study, I have selected newspaper reports on their artistic initiatives, Aravani Art Project's website, as well as Facebook page as primary materials for the study. The paper intends to highlight the significance of their contribution to the LGBT community and their impact on mainstream public space through the theoretical framework of queer phenomenology by Sara Ahmed. Now, the second part of my paper, that is the idea of queer space and curing space. The significance of curing public spaces has been discussed by many, particularly by practitioners of critical geography. However, there are many contextualizations regarding the conception of queer and how a particular space is queered. In the beginning, it was associated chiefly with alternative sexual identities, as discussed by David Bell, John Binney, and Gil Valentine in the mid 1990s. They pointed out that no space has any inherent meanings. Existing hierarchies and power structures conceive it as a heterosexual space through active discursive productions. Hence, I quote, space is not naturally authentically straight, but rather actively produced and heterosexualized, I unquote. However, such conception of the queer space considered it as a fundamentally transgressive, dissident, resistant, progressive, and claimed space. In the early literature, the impact of other factors like race, class, and also how it affects non-normative gender and sex identities were ignored. Later, other scholars criticized it as defeating the fundamental purpose of queer theory as rooted in non-identitarian politics. The issue was that when you associate it primarily with lesbian and gay activism, which is rooted in identity politics, how we can look at it from a queer perspective. That was the argument. Because queer as a theory, queer as a framework is non-identitarian, it's fluid. How can we associate it with identity politics? That was the argument. Many criticized such conception of queer space as reducing itself to simplistic binaries like homosexuality and heterosexuality. In addition, these studies ignore the influence of other factors, as I have already mentioned, the influence of other factors like sex, gender, race, and class in the formation of minority communities and how they are constituted in and constituted by a particular space. That is why Kate Brown argued that, I quote, queer geographies should transgress boundaries such as hetero, homo, and man-woman in order to go beyond normativity and render space fluid, I unquote. This is where Sarah Ahmed's idea of queer phenomenology becomes important. Sarah Ahmed's idea of queer phenomenology becomes significant as it talks about a different kind of cure and curing space. Rather than perceiving cure space from an essentialist perspective, she approaches it as an unfixed, contexted, and disciplinary space, thereby considering all the factors that create and context cure and cured embodiments. Her approach to cure aligns with D.M. Halperin's definition of the cure. According to Halperin, cure is something, I quote, that is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. So here, cure is not just referring to alternative sexual identities. It is all that is outside the normative definition that is available or that is prominent in a society. By looking at the discourse from a phenomenological perspective, she emphasizes both the idea of embodiment and lived experiences. Ahmed talks about how certain bodies are oriented in certain spaces and the resistance such bodies can offer to these spaces. So, and she refers to it as bodily dwelling. And she argues that bodies are shaped by dwelling and also by occupying such dwelling. So, the very fact that we are able to occupy certain spaces and the fact that we are not able to occupy certain spaces constitute who we are as an individual. That is the idea of bodily dwelling according to Sarah Ahmed. And it is important when we think of how queer people occupy certain spaces and not able to occupy certain other spaces. So another thing is that she is not only discussing the resistance and disruption offered by alternative sexual identities to mainstream spaces, but also how at times how they are normalized into the mainstream space through a particular kind of orientation. Here, orientation refers to, I quote, the way space guides bodies into aligning along certain lines, I unquote. Hence, moves beyond the identity politics associated with queer and curing. Refers both to the bodies that are made visible because it will not align itself with other bodies in a particular space, and also the formation of different orientations in a space where queer bodies will not be received as strange. So here, queer is referring to the earlier definition of the term, that is something strange, something something strange, and also the new definition, that is the word as it is associated with gender and sexual minorities. So here, queer refers to both the aspects of the term. Ahmed argues that bodies are oriented towards particular objects in a space. This point is important because when we come to the analysis part, we can see how the art created by the Aravani arts project enables the bodies, not just the transgender body, but also other bodies around them to orient in a particular way. So I have come to the analysis part of my paper. Since its inception in 2016, engaging with mainstream spaces in a non-traditional way and claiming hitherto denied spaces have been Aravani at Project's agenda. I would like to say that I'm not saying that Aravani at Project is claiming mainstream spaces for the first time during the pandemic. That is not the case. They have been doing that since the beginning, but it became more prominent during the pandemic. They say, I quote, "We create safe spaces for alternative voices through art. We examine their spaces of innovation, the places of their history, and create room to learn by transforming this knowledge in the form of public art." I unquote. So, especially during the first COVID and ever since then, they are redefining how queer bodies like the transgender body are perceived in the dominant space through their art. Hence, they are also, in a way, they are trying to reorient other bodies' approach towards them. It is not just about the transgender body or transgender individual. It is also about how other people are perceiving them and how the other people are able to reorient them, reorient themselves. Many studies show that the pandemic has exacerbated the hardships in the lives of traditionally marginalized communities like the transgender community. So, if we look at the literature, there have been extensive studies on how the transgender community and how other sexual and gender minorities have been affected by the pandemic from a sociological perspective, and there are great studies. So, for instance, in one of the studies conducted by Sataruba Dasgupta, they talk about how COVID affects the lives and livelihood of transgender people. They focused on different factors like government's involvement in ensuring their welfare, access to health resources, and the impact of social distancing and isolation on mental health. In another article, the authors brings our attention to the various instances in which the transgender community has been ostracized through stigmatizing measures. My point is that in almost all of this literature, we can see how the transgender community has been marginalized, how their marginalization has been accelerated because of the pandemic, and how they are treated in the mainstream space. And this is where the contribution of Aravani Art Project becomes significant because through their art, they are portraying an image of transgender community which is empowering, and they're portraying themselves as having more agency. So that is one important thing. Here, the Aravani Art Project is reorienting their bodies and bodies around them by queering the mainstream space through their art. So, as I have already mentioned in the paper, the effect of their art is twofold. Firstly, it empowers the transgender community by highlighting their ingenuity to develop plans that put into question the mainstream view that only the state can ensure their welfare. So, from a queer phenomenological perspective and from an idea of curing mainstream space, we have these well-defined relationships in any space. So in a mainstream space, often what happens is that as far as transgender community or any other minority community is concerned, often the state acts as the provider, and these communities have to act as the receiver. So whenever we talk about the welfare of the transgender community, we talk about how the government, especially the governments in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka, have come up with policies and plans for the transgender community, and how at times it is celebrated from a state perspective, but I don't know how it actually contributes to the welfare of the community. It remains questionable, but still, what we can see is that the state is often celebrated as the provider for the transgender community, especially during any sort of hardships. But here in this particular scenario, we can see how the Aravani Art Project is coming up with the plans that will enable them to generate income in a pandemic affected environment. So here the role of state as a provider is questionable, and they are redefining the existing provider-receiver relationship between the state and the transgender community through their art. So that is one thing. So in the existing space, the transgender bodies are always perceived as helpless and agencyless, always relying on the state to provide them welfare during hardships. Contrary to this, Aravani Art Project empowered the transgender community to be powerful agents through their art, especially, for instance, during the first lockdown, they sold their paintings on canvas through Instagram. So usually they are associated with installations and wall murals. But during the lockdown, they sold some of their paintings through Instagram in order to provide income for the community. The income will be divided equally, not equally, but the income will be divided between the person who made the painting, and also some money will be given for the welfare of the community. So this rewrites the existing provider-receiver relationship between the state and the transgender community, and it creates new orientations in that space. And secondly, through their wall art and public murals, they are creating new ways for the transgender body to exist in a mainstream space that is usually queerphobic and transphobic. They were commissioned by different organizations to create wall murals and installations. I really wanted to show you these pictures, but since I had terrible network connection, I didn't think of preparing a PPT. So if you have time, just Google Aravani Art Project and just look at their art installations. You can, it's great. Just have a look at it. So some of the art installations are an art commissioned by Museum of Art and Photography in Bangalore called Story of Bangalore, an art installation in wall art celebrating frontline workers on Kastuba Road, the four-story mural in Chennai, the face of a sex worker painted across a wall in Sonagachi, Kolkata, and a 2,200 square feet artwork to honor COVID-19 frontline workers outside a metro station in Bangalore. So these are some of the projects they have done during the pandemic. All these are instances of curing the public pandemic affected spaces. Sarah Ahmed calls the instances of cure moments in the mainstream spaces queer slants, quote unquote queer slants, where the established.
Parvathy,
Yes, ma'am.
your time is up. You
I will.
exceeded the time.
Yes, ma'am. I will be concluding it right now. So we can see that Aravani Art projects art are examples of queer slants where they are not only redefining how the transgender people, how the transgender community is perceived in the mainstream space, but also how other bodies around them are seeing themselves in relation to the transgender community. That's where the idea of curing mainstream space becomes important. It is not only giving space to the transgender community, it is also about how the existing relationship in a space is being redefined. With that, I would like to conclude my paper. Thank you, ma'am.
I now request the third. I'm sorry, I don't have the name currently with me. The third presenter to make her presentation.
Thank you so much, ma'am. My name is Jagari Mukherjee.
Okay, sorry.
No problem. Good morning, everyone. And I would like to present my content, my screen. Will I be allowed to do that?
Yes, you have been given presenter privileges.
Thank you. Is my screen visible? Hello?
Nope, not yet.
Right.
Is my screen visible now?
No.
Okay. I have started sharing screen. Should I click on something like share content? Is my screen visible now?
Yes.
Okay. So the topic of my paper is the contagion of fallenness, the portrayal of prostitution in Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist and Leo Tolstoy's Resurrection. My paper proposes to study fallen women as agents of social contagion in two 19th century novels with reference to the female protagonists of these novels. These are Nancy from Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist published in 1839, and Katyusha Maslova from Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy, which was published in 1899. These two texts selected for this paper are based on a couple of factors. Firstly, these gained both popularity and notoriety on their publication for the sympathetic treatment by the male authors of fallen women. These novels are popular even to this day, thereby serving as an evidence of the attraction harbored towards the topic of fallen women by readers and writers alike. Secondly, although these two novels were published in different countries, different languages, and across a few decades, all serve to highlight society's hypocritical attitude towards fallen women through a variety of characters' reactions in the novels. The term fallen woman, according to Amanda Anderson, is a wide umbrella term for varying female identities, meaning that we should acknowledge the fluidity of being fallen because the variety of identities allocated to the fallen identity itself connotes a lack of fixture to pre-existing cultural codes. On the other hand, Linda Need makes a distinction between a fallen woman and a prostitute insofar as the terms are dependent on class. The former belongs to upper or middle class, and her sexual indiscretion leading to her fall has no link to her financial requirement, whereas the latter, that is a prostitute, belongs to a lower class and are monetarily independent, often seen as victims of circumstances and therefore objects of compassion. However, for the purpose of this paper, the term fallen woman will be used as a broad umbrella term. In the 19th century, fallen women were often viewed as agents of social contamination. Richard Broad of Royal Holloway, University of London, in his thesis, Water and the Fallen Woman in Victorian Literature and Art, explores the relationship between the fallen woman and water as a polluting agent in David Copperfield, Ruth, and G.F. Watts' painting Found Drowned. In Michelle Roberts' article published in The Guardian titled The Fallen Woman, Prostitution in Literature, she takes the example of Emile Zola's courtesan heroine, Nena, who rises from her working class origins as a virus and infects upper class society in her lust for sex. So let us now examine the two characters under discussion for this paper. Nancy, first of all. Nancy is introduced to us along with her friend Beth as a member of Fagin's gang of criminals in chapter 9 of Oliver Twist. Her untidy appearance, the heavily rouged and make-up face, dirty shoes and socks leave no doubt in the mind of the reader as to her identity as a prostitute. Oliver, an innocent 10-year-old, thinks of them as within quotes, very nice girls indeed. This is followed by the author's ironical remark, as there is no doubt they were, end quote. Nancy's appearance gives an impression of dirt, filth, and disease, a moral contagion in society. Charlie Bates and the Artful Dodger, who are young boys themselves, go off with Nancy and Bet, having been corrupted and contaminated as children. This is a portent of Oliver's future, thieving and dallying with prostitutes if he stayed on with the group. Nancy has been thieving for Fagin ever since she's 5 years old and living with Bill Sykes for many years. She has fallen since her childhood and her innocence destroyed from early on. Thus, she helps the gang by kidnapping Oliver from the bookstall, dressing up as a respectable woman searching for her missing brother. Yet, as the novel progresses, Nancy begins to change in the face of Oliver's goodness and innocence. Dickens shows his readers that even a fallen woman has a tender heart. Other than a tender heart, Nancy also has a conscience. She's acutely and painfully conscious of the shame and sin which define her life and colors even her good qualities. She saves Oliver from being beaten by Fagin after he is brought back. At that moment, her conscience is aroused, and her passion was frightful to see. She screams at Fagin, and I quote, "I thieved for you when I was a child, not half as old as this," end quote. When Fagin attempts to pacify her by saying that she now has a living, Nancy retorts, and I quote, "It is my living, and the cold, wet, dirty streets are my home," end quote. The cold, wet, and dirty streets of London during Victorian England are conducive to the spread of both physical and moral contagion. The world around Nancy is an insalubrious one. She, in spite of the goodness of her heart, is trapped in a diseased milieu, and there is no escape for her. We see how harshly Nancy is judged by so-called respectable folks when she goes to meet Rose Malai at a hotel for the first time. Excuse me. While the manservant hesitates to carry her message to Miss Malai, four chaste housemates affirm that Nancy is a disgrace to her sex and should be thrown into the dog kennel. They are not way far off the mark, as Nancy's relationship with Bill Sykes is abusive and he treats her worse than he treats his dog. Yet, Nancy is infatuated with Sykes and refuses the help offered by Rose, and as a consequence goes to her doom. Later on in the book, the kind Mr. Brownlow offers asylum to Nancy, but Nancy has gone far beyond the realm of hope and has fallen into despair. When Rose, full of pity, cries out what would be the end of Nancy's life, the latter shows her the dark waters of the Thames River, says that those like her usually spring into the tide. Nancy has a grim foreboding of her death. Sadly, when death comes for her, it is not of her own choosing. As this researcher has reiterated before, a fallen woman is said to infect society and thus is removed from society by her death. Nancy's case is a terrifying reminder that not all prostitutes end up being saved, and that all fallen women are not as fortunate as Emily and Martha from Dickens's own David Copperfield. When death finally arrives for Nancy, she meets it at the hand of the man she loves, who violently clubs and murders her. The pus-filled, infected wound of society explodes, blinded by its own blood. Here's a picture of Dickens. And now we come to the next character, Katyusha Maslowa. The French Nobel Prize winner, Romarola, described Tolstoy's novel Resurrection as, and I quote, one of the most beautiful poems of human compassion, perhaps the most truthful ever written. End of quote. Katyusha Maslova, an innocent girl, is seduced by Dmitry Nekhlyudov at the age of 16, gives birth to a child who does not survive, and lives with one protector after another before turning to prostitution. Her moral degeneration begins along with her loss of physical purity. She is forced by circumstances to become a prostitute, but she also hands over her passport to the procuress because the latter tempts her that she can order any kinds of dresses that she wants. Katyusha succumbs to temptation like Eve succumbs to Satan, visualizing herself in a yellow silk dress with black trimmings. Tolstoy does not gloss over the sordid details of a prostitute's life. He describes the daily rituals of Maslow's degraded existence in intricate detail, from her getting up wearily from a dirty bed at 3 or 4 o'clock to the nighttime debauchery with all sorts of men, thus painting a picture of unwholesomeness. The writer also warns that such a life ends for 9 out of 10 men in painful disease, premature decrepitude, and death. This moral degeneration has spread like contagion across all ranks of society. It is this culmination of the spread of this moral contagion that results in Katyusha being accused of poisoning one of her clients. At her trial, Nekhlyudov, her seducer, is on the jury and recognizes her. His conscience is aroused, and he is resurrected as a good human being. However, Maslova, although she is innocent, is found guilty of murder and exiled to 4 years penal servitude in Siberia. At first, she is not moved by Nekhlyudov's repentance. She tells him, quote, "You have used me for your pleasure in this life, and you want to use me to get salvation in the world to come." End of quote. The contagion has seeped so deeply in her soul that it is difficult for her to change her ways soon. It is only slowly that she begins to love Nekhlyudov and brings about positive changes in herself. Nekhlyudov becomes a Christ-like figure to Katyusha's Mary Magdalene and attempts to save her from being exiled to Siberia. However, the novel is replete with images of sickness, disease, and death. The scenes set in the prison to which Maslova is sent are harrowing, with ill and miserable prisoners treated badly by the authorities. Nekhlyudov determines to follow Maslova to Siberia and offers to marry her to redeem his own original sin. It is through Nekhlyudov that the healing from the moral contagion begins. Following Nekhlyudov's petition, Maslova is sent to the prison hospital to work as a nurse. Henceforth, she becomes an agent of optimistic change and recovery. Later on, Maslova helps out other weaker, more unfortunate women prisoners and takes care of them, sometimes appealing to Nekhlyudov to aid them in their time of distress. At the end, Maslova rejects Nekhlyudov's proposal of marriage and decides to accept the proposal of a political prisoner named Simonson, who is in love with her. The once fallen Katyusha Maslova rises in our esteem with her act of self-sacrifice. She loves Nekhlyudov, but does not want to marry him because she knows that he, being a prince, would lose his place of respect in society if he marries a former prostitute. She does not want to contaminate Nekhludoff's position by associating herself closely with him. The novel ends with Nekhludoff alone in his room, reading from the Bible, saved and purified. This is, of course, a photograph of Tolstoy. He was 71 when he wrote Resurrection, but in this photo, he is the same age as Nekhludoff because Nekhludoff is a character based on himself. To conclude, even today, the concept of fallen women exists in many societies. Women in certain parts of the world are killed in the name of honor. Sexual purity is still insisted upon as the norm for women, not for men, and women deviating from this norm, even when it is not by their choice, are treated in a harsh and unjust manner. The two novels, Oliver Twist and Resurrection, may end differently for the two fallen women, but the common thread of lost innocence and social disgrace connect both of them. Today, just as in the 19th century, there is a greater need to change the patriarchal narrative of fallen women. While Dickens's Nancy serves as a terrible warning to fallen women in 1839, Tolstoy's Katyusha is the harbinger of hope and healing 60 years later in 1899. The contagion has abated, and in the 21st century, we can hope and take steps to move only forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Maybe I'll come up with my set of comments. I know that all three of you are PhD scholars, and some of my comments I hope will be of use. And let me also congratulate you all for a wonderful presentation, I would say, especially during the pandemic time. It's been affected all of us in a different manner, but there is also a common feeling of exhaustion and happiness, so on and so forth. So making some presentation is, doing it is really hard, and let me appreciate all of you. So I'm giving some of the comments not as questions, but broader comments may be of use. When it comes to Anuza Subramaniam's, sorry, anything? No? So when it comes to Anuza's paper, Work from Home and how the IT industry is, as an industry, transforming, and how women are working within such spaces is the broader question. I suggest Anuza to look at future of work is a subdomain within gender labor domain. Quite a lot of studies, particularly from the OECD region, not many in the Asia Pacific region, on future of work would be of use if you look at primarily looking at how technology is transforming the world of work, and women are affected in distinct manner. So you did the mapping of literature, wonderful. Primarily the question is also about when it comes to increasing women's participation in the new avenues that are opened up. It's a question of skilling, and many scholars are talking about what kind of skilling is required. And maybe in that sense, you looked at only the work from home scenario, maybe a little more contextual mapping questions in terms of what's going to happen in future, whether a kind of, is it a situation of women losing employment or more opportunities? Plenty of literature available. That contextual mapping has to be a little more rigorous, I think. And then when it comes to work from home scenario, as you said, you came up with several constraints and opportunities. For women, Virginia Woolf wrote about the book titled A Room of One's Own. I always felt an office of one's own, a different space away. But also one point is about, I'm giving you some more points to ponder. The kind of switching that women have to, it's been established that childcare is more of supervisory work when it comes to caring labor, childcare or elderly care. It's not the actual task alone, but a lot of supervisory work, which you need to pay attention to that. And the kind of switching between such emotional labor and the other employment. What is the implications of that? Especially since the online education transferred quite a lot of responsibility to parents. So what are the implications of that is something that you can look at. And also, maybe it's interesting to problematize home and work from home. What is that home here? You assume that there are other people to support you. Maybe you also need to problematize that. What about single women? Can they work? I'm not a single woman, but I'm alone at my place. I was giving a lecture for my class, and several people disturbing, coming, and delivery and food delivery, and you have to pay and all kinds of questions, and you're recording your lectures. It's hard. There is an assumption of a home in this whole work from home arrangement. And that's something you need to problematize the whole home and look at who benefit, who do not, who completely outside of that, so on and so forth. And also, as you said, it also demanded certain kinds of additional learning, switching to different technology and different kinds of challenges. And the whole environment was not enabling at all for additional learning for women at different age groups. So maybe in your field work, you can actually look at it. And it's almost certain that there is no complete going back to the earlier format, precisely because of the additional cost. Institutions are benefiting from reducing the cost, but maybe you need to look at transferring of the cost to the households and women and who is benefiting out of that. Some kind of rough estimate of that transfer in and through the field work would also be great. Well, I end here. Thank you. It was a good presentation.
Thank you for your comments, ma'am. I've added some of this in my longer paper because the presentation was short. I haven't focused on future of work or the rest of the areas. The other comments were very useful. I'll add a little more concrete suggestions based on that. Thank you so much.
And for the presentation, Parvathy Das, I'll come up with all my comments and then ask the floor. Aravani Arts Project of Parvathy Das. In fact, Parvathy, there are few things, particularly in terms of the sequencing of the paper. you have come up with the theory part in the beginning and then
Anna.
in the end about the project. But when one is doing work in the domain of queer theory and politics, it's not about ideas alone. It's always about practices, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So maybe I thought the sequencing has to be like talk about the project itself, and then you bring in theory. Ultimately, theories are for our consumption and it has to help us to understand the project that you're talking about, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Huh. Then, then about maybe if you're asking me, I would call it as self-employment, because you brought in the question of, maybe I'll talk about that now. I completely disagree with you on the welfare, your understanding of the welfare politics. You tell me why you demand for, in the advanced capitalist countries, why they demand for unemployment benefit, because you are unable to work for various reasons. And it is you need to look at the history of welfare capitalism and why, what is the role of the state, how it evolved over time, and why such claim-making politics. And you're talking about a hyper-marginalized community, and you say that welfare, I understand the criticism of welfarism as welfare dolls and agents are not involved in the way in which it's been shaped. I agree, but a self-employment program or any program for empowering program, if I agree that, is not a substitute for state welfare. Read Nancy Fraser's papers. She specifically brought in sexual minorities question, welfare and marginalized communities. She talked about identity politics and the politics of redistribution, how to combine that both. So maybe that's of use. Finally, I think your argument, basically this particular Aravani Arts project, redefining the community's position in the society and the others as well. This is your wishful thinking, I would say. Where is the evidence?
Yes,
You
ma'am.
know? Yeah. So that if you are writing it as a paper, definitely a reviewer will ask for more evidence. That's it. I'm stopping
Ma'am,
here. These
ma'am,
are
may I? Ma'am, may I? I wanted to talk a bit more about the Aravani project, but as you said, I should have started with that so that I could have talked a bit more about them. So that is one thing. And another thing is that I wanted to reiterate in my paper, but I think I forgot to do that. What I'm suggesting is not a replacement for state welfare or state policies, but along with that, other things are also happening. That's
yeah.
what I wanted to highlight, but I think I forgot to mention that disclaimer in my paper. And then as for I forgot to
Maybe
add.
all of you can comment together once I finish.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah. Jagari Mukherjee, I am sorry, I'm not from English studies, and always I refrain myself from commenting anything on another domain. But when I was listening to you, I was thinking about the kind of conclusion that you make, and you arrived at that point later on. Yes, you talked about fallen women in and through two early, very, very celebrated works. And in a sense, it tells us how the Victorian morality shaped femininity early on. And finally, you concluded that how it continued and still very, very present around us very much. So that was your concluding remarks. Elaborate that, because what is the point at this moment in history to relook at those literature? The conclusion maybe in your paper, if you can develop it as a section itself, referring to one or two other books, literature, and then conclude. And when you do that, you realize it's very much there, but how it's actually been restructured, redefined, reformulated, keeping the content intact, perhaps, I don't know, or some major substantial revisions. So otherwise, you know, as someone from a different discipline, this is how I read. Insiders, I don't know, I'm sorry for that. These are some of my comments. I now request others to make your questions, comments, queries to all the three presenters. And then at the end, you will be able to respond very quickly. I think we are running short of time. Thank you all.
Thank you, ma'am.
Any questions? No? Lakshmi? In that case, maybe we'll close the session, right?
In case there are no questions, we can conclude. Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Professor Binitha, and all the panelists for that very enriching session. It was a really interesting take on contagion and gender identities. The next panel, Contagion and Literature, moderated by Professor Abhishek Parvi, will begin after the lunch break at 1:30 p.m. Thank you, everyone, for attending.